Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan.
Be good to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that NATO has learned in Ukraine, or they should have learned. I guess the biggest one is how to train all the Ukrainians that needed to be put into the line. NATO has been involved in that. The U.S. has been involved in that. What have they learned?
Well, they learned that they needed some more preparation. I mean, for example, one of the other lessons they learned was that they're going to have a fast reaction force. It shouldn't be, 40,000 men, which is what they currently have. It should be a lot more, not just for fighting, but for training, because a lot of the training of the Ukrainians is taking part, in Poland and other NATO states that are bordering Ukraine.
Bringing on 100,000 new troops is a huge effort. I mean, what do you do to train that many people in that fast a time?
Well, actually, it's been going on for quite a while. From the beginning, there was a specialist training provided, especially by Britain, which set up a training program in Britain where they could train basically, I think it was 12,000, troops in about 10 weeks. They've expanded that and basically incorporated a lot of Ukrainian instructors. In other words, the more Ukrainians you train, the more Ukrainians you have available to assist in that training. In other words, it eliminates the language problem. A lot of Ukrainians speak English or some English, but they all speak Ukrainian. So the training is moving ahead. The Ukrainians realize that they can't carry out an offensive unless they have trained troops. Ukrainian soldiers are observant, and they noticed one reason the Russians are losing so many is that a lot of the Russian troops are simply not trained, as opposed to having no energy, so to speak, or willingness to be there.
Now, there's been a lot of weapons used there in Ukraine. Has NATO learned anything new about the weapon types that they should be using in an effort against a Russian-type enemy?
Well, yeah, that's been a very important advantage, so to speak, or benefit for NATO. They basically sent, even before the invasion, I mean, they saw it coming. The Ukrainians warned them. They said, look, the Russians are coming. And starting in late 2021, the weapons began flowing in. Now, the Ukrainians have been preparing for this since 2014. That's when they realized they couldn't depend on guarantees, like one made in the 1990s, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for a agreement where Russia would never attack Ukraine. Well, that went by the by. And they have tried a lot of weapons. And NATO found out which ones work best, and which ones are worth, creating more of. That brought out another problem in that NATO had not prepared for a wartime situation where they had to basically replace a lot of weapons and do it quickly. So that was an extremely valuable lesson that they're still digesting.
Yeah, how are the weapons being replaced right now? Because there's been a lot of weapons used, especially anti-tank missiles and like that there in Ukraine.
Well, the problem is that was something NATO had ignored. We knew from the 1973 Arab-Israeli War that modern warfare would basically burn up ammunition and high-tech weapons much faster than we expected. And ever since then, governments have been fighting against taking the obvious solution, developing peacetime larger peacetime reserves of these weapons, spending money on developing the defense industrial base. In other words, the factory capacity that would be idle in peacetime, but could be quickly spun up to produce the weapons. This is the typical false economy of peacetime operations. You know, buried in your archives, you have these truths, but the reality is you have to get appropriations through Congress every year, and they have much shorter memories.
Is the supply keeping up with the demand right now, or are the Ukrainians asking for more stuff and it's just not there?
Well, what the Ukrainians are doing, and they're very clever about this, they don't need the anti-tank weapons as much as they used to, because those were the key to stopping the initial Russian invasion, especially in northern Ukraine, where they tried to grab the capital, Kiev, quickly. They still use a lot of these weapons, but they've shifted to other weapons. For example, the HIMARS, which fires the guided MLRS rocket, the guided rockets, basically. These the Ukrainians found really important for their offensive operations, mainly because they had a lot of people inside the Russian-occupied territories who would report regularly where the Russians were keeping their supply depots, where the headquarters were, and that's why they've been so very effective with the HIMARS rockets, as they have a steady supply of accurate, target locations, and they just take these out. And this has proven devastating for the Russians. They still haven't got a lot of reliable troops, but now they find out they can't even keep their supplies going. They can't resupply their artillery. They keep losing, senior officers because the headquarters keep getting hit. It's really been a basically unsung victory for the Ukrainians. They have basically gone over to weapons they could get more of, and indeed, the United States and Britain have been sending more of their HIMARS. I think even Poland, somebody else sent some of the old track ones, which have twice as many HIMARS rockets on them. So these have been another weapon system which NATO was learning how to effectively use in wartime. It had never been used for a near-peer opponent. In other words, somebody who is similar in capabilities. The HIMARS was very effective in Afghanistan and later in Iraq and Syria. But, now they're up against, how should I put it, an enemy who should be able to, fight back. And the Ukrainians have showed how you can use HIMARS to basically disarm the enemy and and allow an offensive moving forward, which depends on a lot fewer troops and armored vehicles. And that's classic our use of artillery, using it to basically destroy the enemy, and then you just march your troops over them and keep moving. Very clever.
What about UAVs? How have those worked out? And I had heard that the UAVs had been running out for the Ukrainians because they had been effectively stopped by the Russians.
They've had attrition losses, but you got to remember the Ukrainians were building UAVs, before the war. We sent them more. Several NATO nations sent them more UAVs, and they're still getting more. The Russians have been receiving it. The Russians never had many UAVs to begin with. That was something the Russians were always behind in. Before they got sanctioned from so heavily, they were depending upon Israel to show them the tech, and they still do produce some of the some Israeli designs under license, but once the Russians started, attacking all their neighbors, the Israelis, cut that off, and they Russians obtained a lot of UAVs from Iran, but these proved to be less as useful as advertised. There were a lot of duds. They broke down quickly. In other words, like a lot of Iranian weapons, they look good on paper, but if you use them in a near-peer war, as it were, they couldn't take it. So the Ukrainians have not been losing so many UAVs that they still don't use them effectively. Because one of the major uses of their UAVs is to find targets that can attack UAVs. Anti-aircraft systems, both artillery and missile. And these have become a primary targets, not just, for the UAVs, which are not used as weapons themselves, but to provide targets for the HIMARS rockets. So again, the Ukrainians have been quick to come up with solutions, and they've been quicker than the Russians have.
What's the most interesting solution that you've heard about so far?
Letting Ukraine join NATO. This was something that the Russians blame the whole situation on NATO expanding. They make a very litigious case that we promised them we wouldn't. Blah, blah, blah. Well, they lose sight of the fact, and a lot of the people who go along with the Russian arguments lose sight of the fact that the main reason so many Eastern European countries joined NATO in the 1990s and up until currently, Finland and Sweden are doing it, is for mutual protection against Russian aggression. And the Russians are saying, "Oh no, we're just protecting ourselves from Nazis," as the Russians behave like Nazis in Ukraine. They don't have much of a sense of irony, and that is still Ukraine realizes now. They've applied for membership in the European Union. That's an economic thing, but they've also made clear that they're no longer going to compromise, as Russia has insisted they do, to not join NATO. It's absolutely essential that they join NATO. So if the Russians try it again, and that means the Ukrainians are going to drive them out this time, no matter how long it takes, no matter what the cost, if they come back again, they're going to be invading a NATO country. And that's going to bring a whole lot of hurt down on the Russians a whole lot quicker. So that, again, is something that a lot of people missed. The Eastern European countries saw the Russian threat a lot sooner than, the original NATO members, the Western Europeans, because they've been living with it for centuries. The Russians just keep on coming. They'll find an excuse that, oh, no, Eastern Poland belongs to us, or no, this part of Romania belongs to us. Nothing like a powerful defensive organization to cure Russia of those ambitions. And NATO, Ukraine, for a long time didn't believe they had to have it. Sure, we'll appease the Russians. We won't join NATO. Now they see it as an absolute necessity. They, like other Eastern European countries, have been victims of continuous Russian aggression for centuries. This is nothing new. We tend to, in the West, we tend to forget, the Russians, they're different now. Right. But they're still updating.
What about the use of Western forces inside Ukraine? Has anything been going on there?
No, well, we've been scrupulous about keeping our active duty forces out. Now, there are a lot of, former military volunteers. In fact, there are so many Ukrainians living, outside the country, expatriate Ukrainians, that they formed several battalions. And they proudly wear patches, hey, we're Ukrainians from Canada or whatever. And the Russians really can't complain about that. But there's also hundreds of former special forces from all countries, mainly, Britain and the United States. And they basically go over on their own nickel. And the Ukrainians, at first, they used them for combat, but then they realized these guys are a lot more valuable as trainers. Because during that, after 2014, we had a lot of special forces in there. There was the Special Forces Group that had been originally designed to support operations in Eastern Europe. So these guys were finally in their heyday. They've been doing secondary duty in Iraq and Afghanistan and what have you for years. But now they were doing what they've been trained for. And they impressed the Ukrainians quite a bit. So when they had to leave, lest Russia's have an excuse for, I see there's NATO troops there. There were plenty of retired, special forces and what have you, who were welcomed and put to work. In some cases, they were even given some stipends, just living expenses and what have you, because the Ukrainians really appreciated what they could do for them. And these guys helped us train the Ukrainian special forces, who were already quite experienced. They were a decisive group during the 2014 operation in Donbass that stopped the Russian, advance, and held it ever since. So they were happy to get NATO assistance in expanding their numbers from these retired veterans. And that has proven to be a key aspect of the partisan movement, the civilian resistance inside the occupied territories, which, again, the Ukrainians have exploited, very effectively.
I heard that there have even been Belarusians that have gone into Ukraine and have been helping out, even though Belarus is technically on Russia's side at this point.
Well, no, the Belarusian dictator is on Russia's side. At the time of the invasion, Russia had sent in a contingent for training purposes of Russian troops to support the Belarusian president, who had won another crooked election. In other words, he started out as a Democrat, but he went bad. He started rigging elections and what have you. And he was facing more and more popular resistance. And the Russians basically, saved him. Now, the Russians quickly discovered that there's only so far they can go with this. They tried to convince the Belarusians to send troops into Ukraine, but their man there said, no, that's going to get us all killed. And at the same time, it was basically, an open secret that Belarusians were sabotaging the railroad lines going into Ukraine that were a major support element for the initial invasion in northern Ukraine. And ever since, there's basically been a internal resistance in Belarus, supporting Ukraine, because they realize once the Russians are pushed out of Ukraine, there's going to be, how should I put it, a tendency to help the Belarusians, push their Putin out of Belarusia, and that's something that's long overdue.
That'll be real interesting to see that happen. How long before Russia just doesn't have the wherewithal to continue this effort to take the territory there in Ukraine?
Well, they've already lost the initiative. We regularly report on their manpower issues, and they're basically combing the prisons, taking anybody with a pulse, really, no matter what their age, no matter what their physical condition, and they're sending these guys into the front. Now they've gotten a couple hundred of these fellows who were had some training, had some promise. They gave them modern weapons, modern tanks, the latest models and what have you. And they've been using these as an offensive force, but there's not enough of them. I mean, that's all they've got. And the Ukrainians have no trouble piling on these guys, with the HIMARS, with whatever weapons they have. So the Russians basically have no offensive capability. They're losing their defensive capability as the Ukrainians get more efficient, as they have more trained soldiers. going on the offensive, the Russians have a harder and harder time stopping them. They're already being pushed back, and you can tell how bad it is because there are a number of Russian citizens living in the occupied territories, as administrators and advisors or whatever. They are just leaving, and those who aren't leaving, tend to be under mortal threat. Indeed, in Donbass, a lot of the Ukrainian collaborators realized that they might not be too welcome in a Ukrainian Ukraine, and so they're going to Russia, which is not someplace they prefer to go, but it's either that or face something worse. So the defensive capabilities of the Russians are steadily declining as the Ukrainians get better. The Ukrainians are taking their time; they're not rushing it. They've always taken fewer casualties than the Russians, and they want to keep it that way. But whether it involves fighting through the winter, which is pretty brutal, but more brutal for the side that hasn't got much morale to begin with, they're going to keep at it, until the Russians roll out. Meantime, back in Russia, there's whispering about, well, what about Putin? Who's going to replace Putin? Now, technically, that's a capital offense, even discussing that, but it's being discussed anyway, because a lot more Russians, wealthy Russians, powerful Russians, are realizing that they basically jumped on a burning ship, with Putin, and in order to rescue Russia, they've got to basically do something about Putin, but that's their problem.
You reminded me of something that this effort started in the spring, and that winter is now coming. How is that going to affect things?
Well, it's going to be worse for the people on the defense. The Ukrainians, they have morale. They have basically a friendly population in the territories they're attacking. They're more prepared for it. They can get winter clothing, food supplies, and what have you from NATO. NATO realizes that the Ukrainians have been very clever in their tactics and in their requests, and although it's brutal in winter fighting, the side that's better prepared for it is going to have an easier time of it, and that's not the Russians.
So let's wrap things up by talking about the Russian weapon systems and what NATO has learned about them.
They're as bad as they thought they were, as NATO thought they were. This was something we learned during the Cold War. Whenever the Russian, they supplied the Arab states, they supplied, Iran, they supplied a lot of countries with weapons, and they always lost. Now, they were always on the losing side. Now, they would complain, well, it's those Arab operators, they don't know how to use this stuff. But the Israelis stated point blank early on, he says, look, we could switch weapons. We could take the new weapons the Arabs have, and we can give them our weapons, and we still win. Because it isn't the weapons, it's the people operating them. And the Russians never seemed to, realize how important that was. But it became obvious during the Iraq War, first the liberation of Kuwait, and then the 2003 invasion. The Russian weapons were simply no match. Now, since the Soviet Union fell apart, since all these wars were over, the Russians have tried to improve their weapons. They haven't been all that successful, and that has basically been proven again in Ukraine. The Russians have fewer capabilities now because the sanctions have hurt their weapons production capabilities a lot. They didn't realize how much they depended upon key electronic elements, for their smart weapons. And it became painfully obvious, when they ran through a lot of their missile supplies and what have you, and couldn't generate sufficient replacements. Now they've tried, that's why they became allies with Iran, because Iran is a past master of smuggling, and they've obtained some electronic elements, for the Russian weapons manufacturers, but not nearly enough. So the Russians are in bad shape, and it's not getting any better because of the sanctions and because of the number of weapons they do have that they've used up. They've used up most of their missiles, and even the guided missiles and what have you. How should I put it? A higher proportion of them are duds than with Western models. Now that's always been the case. That's something we took for granted during the Cold War, even with their ICBMs. But they were aiming enough of them at us that enough of them would work to basically destroy the world. So they can't do that in Ukraine. They're basically leaving behind a lot of misfires, as it were. A lot of people in Ukraine go out into their neighborhood and see a Russian missile buried in the ground that didn't go off because, thank God, the Russians can't build this stuff.
Their armor has proven very ineffective. Isn't that true?
That's something else the Russians didn't realize until they were up against a near-peer opponent. The Russians in the 1960s, they introduced the autoloader, which eliminated one of the 4 crewmen. The trouble with the autoloader was that it put a lot of live rounds, 20 or more, in the turret. Well, normally in Western tanks or in their older tanks, you'd only have a couple of rounds. So if there was a penetration of the hull that set off, ammunition inside, 1 or 2 rounds, the tank could survive that. But a dozen or more rounds, stored rounds going up, poof, it was all over. So that's why a lot of people notice destroyed Russian tanks. The turrets were blown off, either blown up or just blown clear off the tank. It was total destruction instead of partial destruction. I mean, up until the 1960s, most of the crew would survive a tank being hit and disabled. But with this new improved autoloader, they didn't realize this for decades. But when they finally got into a war where the enemy was taking advantage of this, and they finally, it was too late. This does not work. In fact, what they did recently was they still had some of the old T-64As, which didn't have the autoloader. The T-66 got the autoloader, about 5 or 6 years later in the 60s. They still had some of these in storage, and they brought them in because they were safer for the troops to operate, even if you had to train a human to load the 115 millimeter cannon. So even the Russians became aware of this as a liability, and there's not a whole lot they can do about it. They had developed, active protection systems and what have you, but they never got them to work. Again, the Russians can develop some great theoretical systems, but leave it to the Israelis or the Americans or the Germans to make it work.
Well, we'll leave it there, and till next time.
Take care now. Happy Labor Day.
Oh, yeah.